In 1977, 6 nuns vanished from a remote mountain convent without a trace. No bodies, no notes, only silence. For decades, rumors swirled: cult rituals, secret tunnels, forbidden vows. But nearly half a century later, a forgotten bell tolls again, triggering a chain of revelations that no one expected. What really happened beneath St. Beatrix? It was the kind of cold that settled into bones, quiet and slow, like a whisper meant only for the dead. The Appalachian Mountains stretched dark and solemn under a heavy winter sky. Deep in its folds, nestled among pines half buried in ice, stood the remnants of St. Beatrix Convent, stone-silent, windowless, shuttered for decades. Snow had long since buried the paths that once carried prayers on the wind. Locals had stopped speaking of the place years ago. Now it existed mostly in mutterings and warnings. Disappeared, the old ones would say, then quickly changed the subject. No one remembered how many had left the convent that day. Only how many never came back. It was December 12, 1973, when the blizzard came, or so the records said, yet no official meteorological report documented snow, wind, or any weather anomaly that night. Nothing but a single entry in a diary now yellowed with age. After that, the convent was declared abandoned. It had been waiting since. 46 years later, the new parishioners at the edge of the town of Greystone had little faith left in anything other than survival. The church still stood, barely, and the archdiocese, unwilling to waste further funds, had assigned a young priest no one else wanted to, a parish no one else remembered. Father Louis Martel arrived in gray skies and colder glances. 32, quiet, with eyes that carried too much history for someone so young, he carried only a small bag, a larger crate of books, and a letter that assigned him to the region indefinitely. Beatrix was to be his charge. The church had decided to restore the grounds, not out of faith, but for tourism, perhaps. A historical restoration, they said. But Father Louis had read the older records. He knew about the missing 6. He'd requested this assignment, not for career, but for a question that had haunted him since seminary. What truth lies behind a silence that endures for generations? His first days were uneventful: cleaning, dusting, walking the chapel. The stone arches still stood strong, though moss crept along the altar and the stained glass no longer held light. Beneath the sacristy, Father Louis discovered a locked cellar, rusted with age. It took 3 days to find the matching key, hidden beneath the floorboard behind the confessional. The lock groaned when it opened. The air inside the cellar was dry, bitter with time, but not untouched. Candles melted low, a tarnished crucifix, a velvet pouch containing 3 worn rosaries, and a book, leather-bound, brittle at the edges, its spine stitched in wax. The title had long since faded, but embossed faintly on the first page, beneath a Latin phrase, Sanguis novem, lux nihil. Blood of 9, light of nothing. He turned the page. The handwriting was angular, sharp. Each line seemed etched, not written. It was a liturgical manuscript, but unlike any he had encountered. Psalms woven with invocation. Verses speaking not to God, but to the one who dwells beneath the silence. At the center, a section titled The Ninth Offering. It described a rite: 6 sisters, chosen, 1 hymn, 1 night, 1 silence. And an offering of blood. Father Louis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The date on the final page, December 12, 1973. That night, he did not sleep. He stared at the crucifix above his cot, its carved face dim in the flicker of dying candlelight. Were these pages real? A forgery? A joke by some tormented brother long gone? But the rosary, they were real. And the names stitched into their beads: Sister M. Gracelyn, Sister Leonora, Sister Agslin. Sister Miriam, Sister Agspeth, Sister Teresa. One date. He walked the chapel before dawn. The wind had begun to pick up outside, brushing pine needles against the stone. In the corner beneath the altar, where the book had lain, he found a second object, a small handbell, polished but old. He lifted it gently. On its rim, etched in Latin again, read, Vox vocat post tenebris. A voice calls after darkness. At 7, as the sun climbed feebly behind the clouds, Father Louis rang the bell. The chime echoed into the stone like a question, and in the silence that followed, he could have sworn he heard footsteps. not outside, but beneath him. The sound of the bell had echoed longer than it should have, longer than the stone walls of the chapel could logically hold. Father Louis stood motionless in the early light, listening as silence once again reclaimed the old sanctuary. He waited, unsure of what he expected to happen next, but certain something had shifted, something had awakened. That morning, as the snow continued to fall in fine, endless dust, he returned to the cellar with a flashlight and gloves. He began moving crates that hadn't been touched in decades, their corners softened by time and mouse nests. Behind a crumbling wooden shelf, hidden beneath an old altar cloth, he found it. A bell, not like the small one from earlier, but large, dark, and heavy. The metal was cold to the touch, despite the enclosed space. Its surface was unadorned save for one line carved cleanly around its base. H.A. Nordorman, and a waistcoat centris save for the closed. He turned it slowly, studying the faint etching of an old cruciform design. When he gently tapped the bell's lip with his knuckle, it released a deep, sonorous tone that made his ribs tremble. Then, 12 seconds later, the sound came again, echoed not from within the room, but from somewhere distant, deeper, and undeniably real. Over the next few days, Father Louis rang the bell 3 more times, each time marking the seconds, and each time, precisely at the 12th second, a sound, not identical but similar, answered back. It wasn't an echo. It felt like a response, as if something or someone beneath the ground had heard him. The bell was unlike anything he'd studied. No records in the diocese mentioned a record this old associated with the convent. Curious and unsettled, he began cataloging everything in the cellar for hidden markings. That's when he found the projector. Tucked inside a leather bag lined with mold-resistant fabric, it was a vintage Super 8 model, still intact, still loaded with film. The battery compartment had long corroded, but with care and borrowed tools from a local shop in Greystone, Father Louis managed to restore it. The moment the gears engaged and the reels began to spin, a low mechanical hum filled the small rectory where he had set up the projection. The image flickered onto the old chapel wall. The footage was brief, just under 4 minutes, but it was enough to drain the color from his face. The scene opened to thick mist rolling across a familiar path, one that led to the back of the chapel grounds just beyond the old well. A figure emerged slowly from the fog, her habit fluttering lightly in the breeze. She was walking backward, her steps careful, almost ritualistic. Her eyes were wide, but they did not blink. Her lips moved soundlessly. On the bottom of the frame, the name Sister Agatha appeared, handwritten in ink along the film's edge. Her face looked entranced, not frightened, not in pain, but distant, as though she wasn't entirely there. The film was black and white, grainy with age, but there was no mistaking the surroundings. It had been filmed at St. Beatrix, and based on the wear of the stones, the arrangement of vines and shrubs, it could not have been long before her disappearance. In the last seconds of the footage, the mist thickened around her ankles. She tilted her head sharply to the right, as if reacting to a voice from off-screen. Then she smiled, softly, strangely, and stepped back into the fog. She vanished. No cut, no transition, just mist. Father Louis played the footage again and again. He even muted the hum of the projector to ensure it wasn't interfering with what he thought he heard, because buried faintly in the final second of the reel, when the screen went fully white, was a whisper. He isolated the sound on a digital recorder, slowed it, ran filters. It said, "We answered the bell that we could play from the cellar and placed it in the chapel's nave." It sat at the base of the old stone pulpit, heavy and watchful. Before sleeping, he knelt in front of it, hand resting on the cool curve of its crown. "Who are you?" he whispered. But the bell did not answer. Not then. It was only near midnight, as the wind rattled the stained glass and shadows drew long across the pews, that he woke to a sound, a soft, distant tolling, somewhere far below. 12 seconds later, it came again, and with it, the barest hint of singing, thin, feminine, and not of this time. The whisper had not faded from Father Louis's mind. It lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire, something intangible yet undeniable. He no longer questioned whether something was calling out to him from below. The response from the bell, the film of Sister Agatha's trance-like walk, and now the faint choral hum echoing beneath his feet at midnight, had formed a pattern, one that could no longer be dismissed. He spent the following morning in the chapel's archive room, a cramped space just behind the apse where mildew had made its home among forgotten prayer books and broken candle holders. He scoured old parish registries, architectural blueprints, and restoration records, but it wasn't until he pulled out a water-damaged ledger from 1847 that something caught his attention. Tucked between 2 pages of brittle parchment was a folded sheet of vellum, almost translucent with age, bound by a rosary with 6 beads missing. The vellum unfolded into a roughly sketched map, its corners scorched as if rescued from fire. At first glance, it seemed like a simple layout of the original convent grounds, but the angles were wrong. The structures didn't match the current chapel. More intriguingly, some of the paths curved downward, marked only by small crosses and initials. The letters MELETTM had been written beside what appeared to be 6 alcoves beneath the foundation. Louis paused. The initials matched the 6 rosaries he had discovered with the forbidden book. Sister M. Grace Helene, Sister Leonora, Sister Elspeth, Sister Therese, Sister Miriam, Sister Agnes. He matched each location to a point under the chapel. It formed a spiral, an inward path curling beneath the altar toward a central chamber labeled C7. Beneath that, Via Parentitiae, the Path of Penance. The script matched the ink and stylization of the Forbidden Rite book he had already discovered. The connections were no longer speculative. The 6 sisters were linked not just by time and location, but by something deeper, deliberate. This had been a design. He traced the spiral again, this time placing a finger at the center. Something waited there. That same afternoon, seeking answers in the library annex across from the old convent dormitory, Father Louis came across a Bible, bound in cracked leather and covered in dust so thick he had mistaken it for a floor brick. As he lifted it, a fine puff of decay rose into the air. The pages were stiff, stuck together by moisture and time, but the spine, something about it seemed off. Instead of a uniform thread binding, a jagged line ran vertically down the book's edge. Using a magnifying glass, he examined it more closely. The notches weren't tears, they were intentional, methodical. Dashes. Dots. A Morse code sequence. He spent the next hour transcribing the markings onto paper, cross-referencing each symbol. The code stretched over 42 markings in total. At first, the sentence made little sense. He reversed the sequence. The letters began to align. Slowly, words took shape. The 7th cell was never sealed. Louis blinked at the translation. The 7th cell was never sealed. The 7th, not 6. He thought back to the map, 6 initials, 6 rosaries, 6 alcoves, but the central chamber, marked C7, he hadn't accounted for that numerically. The 7th cell wasn't another sister, it was a place, or perhaps something, someone, held within. Or never held at all. He flipped through the Bible's front pages. A faint inscription read, "To Sister Lenora, in hope that she forgets not the light." It was dated 1970. This had belonged to one of the missing. Had she carved the code herself? Why? The following night, unable to sleep, Louis returned to the map beneath candlelight. He traced the path again, more slowly this time. Each alcove bore an etching of a saint's name beside the initials, except the center. The central chamber bore no name, only an inverted cross burned into the page. He checked the reverse of the vellum for more markings. There, in faded script, almost illegible, "Only the bell can open what was never closed." A shiver ran down his spine. Was that why the bell echoed back 12 seconds later? Was the reply coming from the 7th cell? Was it already opened? He thought of the whisper from the projector reel. "We answered the bell." But what if they hadn't answered willingly? Suddenly the wind outside howled with a force that made the stained glass groan. The bell on the altar vibrated without being touched, then stopped, then rang once, deep, guttural, slow. Louis stood frozen, heart hammering, counting the seconds. 12 beats passed. Then a second tone, fainter, far away. And this time a voice followed. Not a whisper, a single word. Close. The word had echoed in Father Louis's mind all day. Closer, not as a suggestion, but as a command. as if something unseen had begun to breach the walls between thought and reality. He barely slept that night, and when he did, sleep came not as rest, but as revelation. The dream unfolded with chilling consistency. First came silence, then the rush of wind, followed by a ring of fire that crackled but emitted no heat. Within the flames stood 6 figures, tall, still, robed in white habits that fluttered gently despite the absence of wind. Their faces were partially veiled, but their mouths moved in perfect unison. They sang a slow, rising chant, not in Latin or Greek or anything Louis had ever encountered in his theological studies, but in a guttural, undulating tongue that vibrated within his chest like the hum of distant thunder. The language was ancient, older than the church itself, yet it stirred something familiar in his bones. As he strained to comprehend the words, he awoke each time in a cold sweat. The sheets twisted around his limbs like bindings, the sound of the bell tolling in his ears even though the chapel remained silent. On the 3rd night of the same dream, one of the women turned to face him fully. Her eyes were glassy, almost reflective, as if showing him something instead of seeing. Her mouth formed one word, Sema. He wrote it down upon waking, the syllables echoing on the paper like an unfinished prayer. He couldn't place the language until he began digging through an old phonetic lexicon of liturgical tongues stored in the abbey's theological vault. It was Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The word meant signed. Louis was stunned. There were no records of Ge'ez ever being used in St. Beatrix. The nuns here were mostly of French and Irish heritage, their traditions deeply Roman Catholic. Why, then, would they be singing in a language they couldn't have known? Unless, of course, the dreams weren't conjured by his subconscious, but delivered from beyond. That same week, as the snow began to soften and the pine trees dripped slowly under the weak sun, Louis heard about an incident in the woods near the old pilgrimage trail just a mile beyond the convent grounds. 3 local teenagers had wandered into the forest to film a TikTok challenge, something about night survival with a thermal camera. They'd posted the footage that morning before it was taken down for visual distress. Curious, Louis reached out to one of the boys, a wiry, nervous-looking kid named Wes, who worked part-time at the general store. "I didn't believe in that stuff," Wes stammered, shifting on his feet. "But man, what we saw, it wasn't right." Louis convinced him to show the original footage, still saved on his phone. The video was grainy, filmed in night mode. At first, it was the usual teenage bravado, laughing, shouting, pretending to be scared. Then the camera stuttered, reacting to a spike in temperature that should not have occurred in the midwinter forest. In the center of the frame, a burst of light, brief, ovular, and eerily still, flared and pulsed 3 times. It hovered 3 feet above the ground, flickering like a flame, but casting no light on its surroundings. Louis paused the frame and enlarged it. The shape was unmistakable. A vertical flame with a bend at the top, forming a shape identical to a historical depiction he had seen only once, buried deep within a forbidden manuscript from the 1800s, labeled Lux Virginis, the flame. He rushed back to the convent's archives. Hidden within a collection of regional miracle accounts from the early 19th century, he found it, a sketch dated 1803, attributed to a monk named Benedictus who had served in the same region. The drawing was crude but accurate. Just 6 feet had found its famously, as in the video. Benedictus had called it the sign of the unconsumed, a divine warning that had appeared only twice in recorded history. Once before a plague, and once before the collapse of a monastery buried under avalanche. Both times, women of the cloth were said to have witnessed it. Now, more than 2 centuries later, it had appeared again, this time to 3 boys who neither prayed nor believed but happened to be looking through the right lens. That evening, Louis stood in the chapel long after dark, clutching the vellum map of the spiral and the Morse-translated phrase about the 7th cell. He placed the old bell in the nave and knelt beside it. He whispered the word from the dream, Sema. 12 seconds passed. Then, faintly, the chant from his dreams rose through the floorboards. He heard 6 voices. Then a 7th, deeper, out of harmony, speaking a name he had never told anyone. The seventh voice whispered his name in a tone that was not cruel, but commanding, as if summoning something ancient that had slumbered beneath syllables long forgotten. Father Louis froze in place, his breath caught in his throat as the resonance faded into the floor beneath him. That night, sleep was not an option. Instead, he sat in the nave, candle burning low, fingers curled tight around the old bell's handle. When the sun rose, it did so pale and uncertain, casting long gray streaks across the stained-glass windows. The sky had cleared of clouds, and the calendar reminded him of a detail he hadn't noticed until now. It was the first full moon of the new liturgical cycle and the last full moon of the winter. Traditionally a time of fasting and penitence, but here, in this place, it would mark something else entirely. By late afternoon, as the light waned and the moon took its place in the sky with uncanny brilliance, something strange stirred in the chapel. While adjusting the candelabras on the altar, Louis noticed the statue of the Virgin Mary, tall, robed, her arms outstretched in permanent welcome, had shifted. Not by much, but enough. He double-checked the base. The dust ring revealed that the entire pedestal had rotated exactly 15 degrees. Its gaze now pointed away from the sanctuary and toward the overgrown path leading to the forest's edge, where a dried-up lakebed had long since been forgotten by maps. The stone should not have been able to turn. The base was fused to the floor, affixed with iron bolts that had rusted into place. He ran his hand along the joint, no recent tampering, no marks, and yet the Virgin now faced the woods. A quiet dread settled over him like a second skin. He followed her gaze. With flashlight and cloak, Louis trudged through the snow, past the threshold where grass no longer grew. The old maps had shown a small body of water once named St. Agnes's Hollow, a glacial sink that dried decades ago after the land cracked during a minor earthquake. The locals had stopped going near it. Dogs bark at nothing down there. Now it lay still, a flat basin of packed earth ringed by skeletal trees. Moonlight illuminated its center like a stage. He began pacing the perimeter, scanning the dried earth for something, anything, that didn't belong. 40 minutes passed before his boots struck stone, not a rock, but a square slab set into the earth, obscured by years of decay and fallen leaves. He dropped to his knees, dropping away debris until a seam revealed itself. A cover. A door. He found a rusted iron loop embedded in the stone and, with great effort, pulled. The hatch lifted reluctantly, groaning on long, silent hinges, releasing a burst of air so dry and ancient it made his eyes water. A narrow stairwell spiraled downward, cut directly into the bedrock, each step slick with condensation, each breath growing coldly. He descended slowly, counting silently. At 57 steps down, the stairs opened into a narrow tunnel, carved crudely but deliberate. He flicked a flashlight beam forward, and it struck a wall 59 meters ahead. He measured by pastes instinctively, years of monastery training calculating space. The tunnel stretched straight, unbroken, ending at a heavy stone wall. The air was dense, almost vibrating. The walls bore no markings, no crosses, no iconography. But the silence, it pressed against his ears, alive and thick. At the end of the corridor stood a single niche, carved into the stone, housing a life statue of St. Joseph, staff in one hand, the child Jesus in the other. The sculpture was detailed, reverent, but something was wrong. Lou approached and raised the beam of light. Across the statue's chest, faint brown streaks ran downward from the neck, dried, flaking, dark. He reached out and touched it. His fingers came away red, brown, blood. Long dried, coagulated, soaked into the stone. He scraped a sample into a sterile cloth, wrapped it tightly, and marked the spot for return. He turned to leave, but as he did, he noticed something in the base of the pedestal, a small rusted plate, half buried in the floor. He pried it loose. Underneath, nestled inside a shallow recess, lay a length of old cloth, monastic, white linen, stained, folded tight. Embroidered into the edge were initials, barely visible, M.M., Martina Therese, one of the 6. Back at the rectory, he sealed the sample and called a colleague at a private forensic lab associated with the diocese, insisting on discretion. He sent the dried sample, the cloth, and requested DNA analysis against church records, which contained blood types and relative markers for many members of religious orders. 3 days later, the call came. "It's a match," the lab technician whispered, voice uncertain. "The blood on the statue, it's from Sister Martina." "But here's the thing, Father, based on degradation levels, the sample isn't 4 decades old. It's newer, less than 5 years. The discovery that Sister Martina's blood was less than 5 years old shattered Father Louis' already fragile framework of logic. She had vanished 39 years ago, presumed dead alongside 5 others, yet the dried streaks on the statue's chest were fresh by forensic standards. That could only mean one of 2 things. Either someone had preserved her blood for decades in a method bordering on the unnatural, or worse, she had still been alive not long ago. His mind reeled with possibilities, none of them comforting. The sealed hatches, the bell's echo, the voices in dreams, it all pointed towards something ongoing, not past, and all of it had been kept out of public view. As he combed through records, a glaring detail surfaced from the convent's post-closure transaction history. The land, including the dried lakebed and surrounding forest, had been purchased in 1982 by a private entity. The price listed was absurdly low, practically a gift, 12 times below market value, even by conservative appraisal. The buyer's name, Victor Durrell, a wealthy recluse. Durrell owned several properties across the region, but had made only one public appearance in Greystone during the past 3 decades. Most locals referred to him as a ghost with money, a man who funded civic works from the shadows, never attended Mass, and lived in a gated estate behind the former convent lands. What piqued Louis's estate further was that Victor's estate included a massive underground wing, registered under Environmental Preservation Research, but which no town official had ever inspected. It sat near the site of the stone tunnel where Louis had found the blood. All access roads to that area were fenced and monitored, with private property signs posted at each turn. Driven by urgency and conviction, Father Louis requested a meeting under the guise of local pastoral outreach. To his surprise, Durrell accepted. The mansion was austere, built of dark stone and iron-framed windows, perched atop a hill overlooking the forgotten convent grounds. As Louis was escorted into the main hall, he felt the weight of history pressing in, not the peaceful sanctity of faith, but the cold meticulousness of control. Victor Durrell entered the room precisely at 7. He was tall, thin, with a shock of silver hair combed back with rigid precision. His suit was immaculately tailored, but it was his eyes, pale blue, calculating, almost reptilian, that unnerved Louis the most. "I suppose this is about the convent," Victor said, without invitation or pretense. Louis nodded. "And the land beneath it, particularly the sealed tunnels. I believe something sacred is buried there, or someone." Victor's expression twitched, a micro-gesture, but his voice remained even. "The church sold that land 4 decades ago. Whatever ghosts you're chasing, Father, they belong to memory, not to me." "I found blood in the stone tunnels," Louis said quietly. "Recent blood, from a missing sister. You must know that place was never truly decommissioned. Something remains active down there, and I believe you've ensured it stays hidden." Victor's lips curled slightly, a smile that bore no warmth. "You're wasting your breath. There is no crime. There is no body, superstition. And you, Father, have spent too much time listening to wind in walls." But Louis had come prepared. He drew from his coat a yellowed photo from the town archives, Greystone's 1973 sheriff and his teenage son standing at the chapel steps during the investigation into the missing nuns. Louis placed it on the table. "You were there, weren't you? Not just as a resident? That's you, isn't it?" Victor did not glance down. "My father was sheriff," he said after a pause, "about her the Drawn Cross Society, and yes, I was there. But you misunderstand something essential, Father. My father didn't just enforce law. He belonged to something older, the Order of the Drawn Cross." Louis felt his stomach tighten. That name, the Drawn Cross Society, had only surfaced once before, buried in a Vatican report on rogue Catholic brotherhoods that mixed folk rituals with church hierarchy in the 18th and 19th century. Most had been dissolved, their practices condemned, but a few had survived in secrecy under new names. Victor stepped forward slowly. "You have no idea what those women were trying to awaken. They weren't saints. They were conduits. The seventh cell is not a place. It is a keyhole. And they, those 6, were trained to be keys? You're lying, Louis said, but his voice faltered. No, Victor replied. I'm protecting what remains sealed. My father knew it. So did the bishop who sold the land. And if you had any sense, you'd walk away now and let history stay buried. Louis stepped back, heart racing, but not in fear, because in Victor's eyes, behind the calm and the confidence, he saw something else. He saw guilt. He saw fear. And he saw that Victor hadn't been down there in a very long time. The next morning brought more than frost and wind. It brought a phone call from a regional clinic perched along the forested ridgeline 30 miles north of Greystone, a call that would fracture the already crumbling structure of Father Louise's understanding. The voice on the other end, a nurse named Diana, spoke in a rushed whisper, barely able to contain her confusion. Have a woman here? Elderly, maybe 70, maybe more. She was found wandering the edge of the wildlife boundary. Says her name is Sister Lenora. Claims she's been underground. Says she came from the earth itself. Louis froze, his fingers tightening around the receiver. Sister Lenora. That name, one of the 6, one of the alcoves, one of the keys. He demanded they keep her there and promised to arrive before sundown. The drive was a winding blur of sharp turns, pine shadows, and the thundering rhythm of blood in his ears. By the time he reached the clinic, the sky had turned the color of bruised parchment, and the mountains loomed like old sentinels guarding unspeakable truths. Inside, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Diana met him at the door, her eyes wide, her voice low. She speaks in fragments, English, Latin, something I couldn't place, maybe Old German or Hebrew, but she says your name. She asks for the bell, priest. Her hair, though thin, was silvery white and neatly braided. Her eyes, milky but alert, fixed on Louis the moment he entered. Frater? Louis, she rasped, half question, half certain he'd see. He knelt slowly beside her, unsure whether to cross himself or simply listen. I'm here, he said gently. Are you Sister Lenora? Her lips quivered, and she nodded, then muttered a sentence in Latin. We descended. We were not taken. Louis leaned closer. What do you mean? She closed her eyes briefly, then began to speak in broken phrases, the story spilling from her like a cracked jar that had held too much for too long. There was a sound beneath the stone, always humming, not cruel, but old, patient. We thought it was the voice of mercy, the voice of Christ, deeper than the earth. The bell, it called to us not with sound, but with longing. We prepared, we fasted, we took vows in silence, and then we walked. Her voice trembled. 6 of us, hand in hand, robes white. It was not a tomb we entered. It was a womb. Louis felt the breath leave his lungs. Why? He whispered. Why go willingly? Lenora opened her eyes again, and in that moment they were radiant with something otherworldly. Because it wept, we felt its sorrow, not a demon, not a curse, a wound old and forgotten, and we were taught to listen for tears. She raised her hand, motioned for him to come closer, but she stayed behind longer. She was strong. She bore the songs even when the rest of us could not. Sister Martina. She sang for the wounded one. She sang until her throat bled. Her voice cracked then, and she fell into soft sobs. Louis reached out, gripping her hand, feeling the bones beneath paper-thin skin. Where are the others? He asked. Lenora shook her head slowly. Some are ash, some are in the stones. One still sing. Diana re-entered then with water, and Lenora drank slowly, whispering between sips in what Louis now recognized as Jugé, phrases that mirrored the chants in his dreams. It wasn't captivity, she repeated after a long pause. It was covenant. We gave ourselves, not to be found, but to hold the seal. Louis's mind raced, colliding with fragments, the 7 alcoves, the 7th cell never sealed, the bell's toll, Victor Durell's cold warning. He thought he had been unraveling a tragedy of abduction and occult silence. But what if it had been something else entirely? A chosen silence, a voluntary descent, an act not of fear but of sacrificial empathy. Then what was sealed beneath the ground was not evil, but grief. He looked again at Sister Lenora, who now rocked gently, humming a haunting fragment of the same melody that had haunted his sleep. And suddenly he understood something deeper than words. The past wasn't returning to haunt the present. It had never left. It had only been waiting to be heard again. The wind howled outside the clinic, as if protesting the truths being unearthed inside, but Father Louise had no time to ponder symbols or signs. Sister Lenora's voice, broken and trembling, had given him something far more tangible: direction. She had spoken of a chamber beyond the seventh echo, hidden behind stone, unmarked on any map, accessible only when the bell was struck under full moonlight while the statue turned its gaze. She described in vague but deliberate detail a pattern of sounds she remembered from her descent. 7 tolls, each followed by silence, and then a shift in air pressure, a whisper of dust, and finally a breathless opening. Louis wasted no time. He contacted a trusted contact within the diocese's historical archaeology unit, someone he knew believed in more than just dates and stones. Within 48 hours, a team of 3 arrived, discreetly posing as restoration experts, accompanied by sonic scanners, infrared mapping tools, and ground-penetrating radar designed for deep caverns and crypt assessments. Their base camp was set in the shadow of the dried lake bed, where the wind had grown eerily still, and even birds dared not sing. Louis led them to the far wall of the tunnel beneath St. Agnes's Hollow, where he had previously found the statue of St. Joseph and the cloth bearing Sister Martina's initials. He pointed to the back wall, explaining Lenora's testimony that beyond the stone lay a space untouched by record or rumor, a place the church itself had forgotten. The team's scanning began just before dawn, and by noon the radar confirmed it, a circular cavity measuring 111 meters in circumference, bordered by dense stone that showed no natural fracture lines. It was not a cave. It was made, walled in, designed to never be found. With extreme care, the team began to break through the stone, a process slowed by humidity, echoing vibration, and a strange magnetic interference that played havoc with electronic tools. Louis prayed silently, as every strike of hammer and chisel echoed through the earth like a heartbeat returning after long silence. After 6 hours, a hollow sound rang out, followed by a visible shift in pressure. The dust that rose from the cracked wall spiraled upward unnaturally, as if drawn towards something unseen. The final slab fell inward, and a gust of air, dry, ancient, metallic, rushed past them. They stepped through the breach into a vast stone chamber whose air was so still it felt preserved. The walls were smooth and arched, and the floor bore markings in ash and wax, long faded but faintly visible under light. The space was circular, ringed with alcoves, each carved into the perimeter. 5 doors stood evenly spaced around the chamber, made of aged cedar and iron, their hinges surprisingly intact. No crosses adorned them, no scripture. Just names, etched faintly but unmistakable: Gracelyn, Agnes, Elspeth, Miriam, and Therese. One by one, the team opened the doors, their cameras recording everything. Inside each, they found a small room furnished with simple cots, shelves, clay basins, candle nubs, and cloth-bound books. Journals, perhaps, or liturgical writings. The scent of oil and incense still lingered faintly. In 4 of the 5 rooms lay skeletal remains, wrapped reverently in white habits, hands folded over rosaries made from knotted thread and carved stone. None showed signs of struggle, no chains, no restraints, only peace. Louis stepped into each room, heart clenching with a strange mixture of reverence and sorrow. These women had not been imprisoned. They had chosen this, whatever this was. They had lived here, hidden from the world, and eventually they had died here, together, but unseen. In one room, the room marked Therese, no body was found, only a long braid of dark hair wrapped around a candle stub, and a wall carving of the Virgin weeping over an open door. It bore a date, August 19, 1997. The team documented everything meticulously, but Louis moved slowly, touching each object with care, whispering prayers for the departed. In the central chamber, beneath a domed ceiling, etched with what appeared to be concentric flames, a 7th door sat sealed with melted wax and 7 iron nails. It bore no name, no handle, only a shallow carving of a bell and the faint Latin inscription, non clausum. Sed custodium, not sealed, guarded. As the archaeologists debated how to approach it, Louis turned toward the far corner of the chamber, where a pile of folded linen sat, and beneath it something flickered, an object catching the flashlight beam with an unnatural gleam. He reached for it and pulled it free. It was a key, warm to the touch and not covered in dust. Someone had placed it there recently. Father Louis stood in the center of the hidden chamber, the ancient key heavy in his hand, its surface strangely warm, as if responding to his presence. The archaeologists hesitated near the seventh door, uncertain how to proceed without damaging its structure, but Louis stepped forward, guided not by logic but by instinct, the same instinct that had pulled him through dreams and whispers, through bells and shadows. He knelt before the sealed threshold, pressed his palm flat against the wax, and whispered a prayer. Then, slowly, he inserted the key into the carved notch just beneath the bell symbol. It slid in with eerie silence and turned with a soft click. A rush of warm air escaped the seal, carrying with it a faint fragrance of frankincense and rosemary. The wax cracked, the nails fell out in sequence, like a ritual being undone by unseen hands, and the heavy stone panel shifted inward with a groan that echoed like thunder through the chamber. Behind the door lay a corridor narrower than the others, its walls lined with faint sigils etched in bone-white chalk that shimmered slowly under flashlight. The corridor bent left, then dipped slightly downward and ended at a rounded iron door barely 4 feet tall. Louis crouched and pushed it open, and what he saw froze him in place. A woman, impossibly thin yet sitting upright, stared at him with sun-counted but aware eyes. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, but her gaze sharp and lucid. She clutched a rosary made of what looked like vine stems and fishbone, her fingers trembling. Behind her were 6 stone platforms, 4 occupied by robed skeletons, each one carefully wrapped in white linens, surrounded by dried herbs and beeswax candles. At the center of the chamber was a small altar made of stone and bone, with the remnants of an oil lamp that had long since gone cold. The woman opened her mouth and spoke, her voice raspy yet strong. "I knew you'd come. I dreamed your face." Louis fell to his knees. "Sister Miriam?" She nodded slowly, her head trembling under the weight of years. "I stayed," she said simply. They needed someone to keep vigil. Louis approached her with reverence, kneeling beside her, tears filling his eyes. How are you alive?" She smiled faintly. "The grace of penance, the rhythm of ritual, and her mercy," she whispered, gesturing to a carved symbol above the chamber's dome, a stylized heart surrounded by 7 drops. "I was not meant to be freed, only to wait, until the bell rang and the echo returned with your name." The medical team moved in cautiously, awed by the scene, preparing emergency aid. Her pulse was slow but stable, and though her body bore signs of extreme deprivation, there was no infection, no decay. Her survival bordered on the miraculous. "I sang to them," she murmured as they placed blankets over her shoulders. "When they could no longer speak, I anointed them. I listened for their breath long after it stopped." The silence grew kind. It wrapped me like a shawl, and I never feared it. Back in the chapel above, as Louis returned to gather Sister Lenora for the reunion, something extraordinary occurred. The stained glass window that had sat above the altar for over a century, depicting 6 nameless nuns kneeling before a faceless light, began to shimmer subtly in the morning sun. Lenora gasped as she looked up. The glass, once faded by time and dust, now gleamed with renewed color. And slowly, impossibly, the faces of the 6 nuns began to return to form, one by one, their features clarified, their expressions serene, their hands raised not in supplication but in release, as if the window, too, had been waiting for something to end, waiting for someone to finish the vigil. A light broke through the chapel ceiling, soft and golden, refracted through the newly luminous window, casting 6 beams of color onto the stone floor, in perfect alignment with the pews where the missing sisters had once prayed. And at that moment, for the first time in 46 years, the convent of St. Beatrix exhaled. They transported Sister Miriam from the underground chamber with reverence, not as a rescue, but as a procession of return. Her frail body rested upon a stretcher wrapped in linen and lavender, and yet her eyes, those deep wells of silent endurance, remained alert, tracing the chapel arches above, as if reacquainting herself with the world she had once voluntarily left behind. Doctors and clergy worked together to stabilize her condition, but no one could fully explain the impossible biology of her survival. She had been sealed underground for nearly half a century, without sunlight, without fresh air, nursed only by sacrament and spirit. And still she spoke. She prayed, she remembered. The church arranged for her care at St. Lydia's monastic hospice, a convent-turned-sanctuary for aging sisters nestled in the hills above Montclair. There, among pine groves and echoing bells, she began to recover, not merely in body, but in presence, becoming more than a relic of suffering. She became a symbol of the kind of faith that is unshaken by darkness, the kind that listens to silence and still sings. Father Louis visited weekly, and every time he entered the room, she would raise her eyes and whisper, "The light is closer now." As spring returned and grass bloomed along the old chapel walls, the statue of the Virgin Mary, once turned 15 degrees toward forgotten shadows, shifted again, this time naturally, imperceptibly, and without interference. Its gaze now aligned directly with the chapel's eastern window, where dawn spilled gold across the altar each morning. No one could say how or when the change occurred, but parishioners noticed it. Children stopped to touch its robe. Pilgrims began arriving, drawn by whispers of miracles and songs beneath stone, and slowly, reverently, the community around St. Beatrix returned. Confession lines grew longer. Candles flickered into the night. Silence became sacred again. On the 47th anniversary of the sisters' disappearance, a memorial service was planned, not a funeral, but a mass of light and remembrance. The Vatican, having reviewed the evidence, declared the incident neither myth nor miracle, but a mystery of chosen devotion. A plaque was installed beside the chapel door bearing the names of all 6 nuns: Sister Gracelyn, Sister Agnes, Sister Elspeth, Sister Lenora, Sister Martina, and Sister Miriam, the last still alive, a breathing testament to a story that defied time. That morning, the chapel overflowed. People stood in the aisles, filled the fields outside, some holding candles, others simply holding each other. Sister Lenora was wheeled in beside Miriam, her eyes wet but calm. The stained glass window above the altar glowed vividly now, each of the 6 sisters depicted in robes of sapphire and crimson, their expressions serene, eternal. Father Louis stood at the lectern, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. He read from the Book of Wisdom, then closed his Bible and looked over the congregation, pausing long before he spoke. "There are some things we are not meant to solve, only to witness," he said. "Some absences are not losses, but offerings." As he stepped down, he walked to the front pew, took Sister Miriam's hand, and helped her to stand. The congregation quieted to a hush. Her voice, thin and trembling, rose not in volume, but in clarity. She looked at Louis and whispered words that seemed to rise from the stone itself. "We were never lost. We only went far enough to keep the light burning." At that moment, sunlight struck the window at a perfect angle, casting 6 columns of color across the floor. The church bells began to ring, not by human hand, but as if stirred by wind or something older. Miriam smiled, her eyes closing as the light bathed her face. And for one suspended breath, the entire chapel held its silence, not in fear, but in awe. Not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Faith, it seemed, had never left. It had only waited for the right soul to listen, for the right heart to remember. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more mysteries that reveal themselves piece by piece. I'm curious, what part of this story gave you chills? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts and location in the comments below. I read every one.